As we enter the second week of January 2026, the Islamic Republic of Iran finds itself immersed in what many analysts describe as the most sustained and widespread wave of internal instability since the 1979 revolution. What began as localized strikes in Tehran's Grand Bazaar, driven by soaring prices and the collapse of the currency, has transformed into a nationwide uprising reaching every corner of the country and challenging the foundations of the theocratic regime. On January 10, 2026, the protests mark 13 consecutive days, having spread to more than 350 locations across all 31 provinces. Human rights organizations report an alarming human cost. At least 62 confirmed deaths, including 48 protesters, among them 8 or 9 children and 14 members of the security forces. More than 2,300 arrests have been documented, although independent sources indicate the real number of detainees may reach tens of thousands, with many disappearing into the regime's feared prisons. This wave of instability is not a passing outbreak, but a profound expression of accumulated grievances. The protests represent the greatest internal challenge to Iran's clerical leadership in at least 3 years, surpassing in scope and geographic reach even the 2022 demonstrations following the death of Mahsa Amini. Videos smuggled out despite the near-total internet blackout show tens of thousands marching in major cities such as Tehran, Isfahan, Mashhad, and Tabriz, chanting slogans that have evolved from economic complaints into explicit calls for regime change, death to the dictator, Khamenei is a murderer, and even nostalgic cries for the return of the Pahlavi monarchy, such as Reza Shah, your soul is happy. In smaller cities and rural areas, especially in western provinces such as Kurdistan, Kermanshah, Elam, Loristan, and Hamadan, historically marginalized regions, clashes have been particularly brutal, with protesters setting fire to government buildings, police vehicles, and regime symbols, including banners of Supreme Leader Ayatollah Ali Khamenei. The immediate trigger of the uprising was economic despair, ignited on December 28, 2025, when merchants at Tehran's historic Grand Bazaar closed their shops in protest against the drastic devaluation of the Iranian currency. In early January 2026, the Iranian Rial hit historic lows, trading at around 1.4 million per dollar on the parallel market, a drop of roughly 50% in value in just 1 year. Inflation, officially above 50% but estimated by independent economists at 70 to 80% in real terms, has made basic goods unaffordable for millions. Food prices have exploded. Meat and dairy rose 200 to 300% in some regions, while bread, a staple of the Iranian diet, doubled in price. Energy blackouts and fuel rationing have worsened the crisis, leaving families in the dark and cold during the harsh winter. This economic collapse is not the result of natural disasters or global market fluctuations, but of the regime's political choices over decades. Iranian leaders have directed immense resources toward military adventures and ideological projects, leaving the domestic economy in ruins. Estimates from sources such as the U.S. State Department indicate that Tehran spends between $20 to $30 billion per year on its nuclear program, ballistic missile development, and support for militias across the Middle East. This includes funding Hezbollah in Lebanon, estimated at up to $1 billion annually, the Houthis in Yemen, estimated at $200 to $500 million per year, Hamas and Islamic Jihad in Gaza, estimated at $100 to $300 million annually, and various other Shiite militias in Iraq and Syria. These expenditures, often hidden by the regime's budgetary opacity, come at the expense of public welfare. Infrastructure is crumbling. Roads, hospitals, and schools in provinces such as Sistan and Baluchistan remain underdeveloped, while subsidies for essential goods are cut to finance these external engagements. Economic mismanagement is compounded by international sanctions, reimposed and intensified under the Trump administration's maximum pressure campaign, revived in full force after his re-election in November 2024. Oil exports, Iran's main source of revenue, have fallen to less than 500,000 barrels per day, far below the pre-sanctions peak of 2.5 million. This has generated a fiscal deficit estimated at 10 to 15% of GDP, forcing the government to print money and fuel hyperinflation. President Masoud Pezeshkian, inaugurated in 2024 with promises of reform, admitted the government's impotence by eliminating subsidized dollar allocations for imports in holy cities such as Qom, a move that alienated even traditional supporters of the regime. As one protester in Tehran said in a video smuggled to BBC Persian, We can't feed our families while they send billions to wars that aren't ours. However, as in previous uprisings, the economy was only the spark. Within days, the protests transcended material demands, channeling deep frustrations over political repression, corruption, and social controls. Women, who led the 2022 demonstrations after the death of Mahsa Amini in morality police custody, are once again on the front lines, defying hijab laws and leading chants for gender equality. Ethnic minorities, Kurds, Baluchis, Azeris, and Arabs have joined in large numbers, highlighting regional neglect and discrimination. In Kurdistan province, a general strike called by groups such as the Iranian Kurdish Democratic Party and Kamala paralyzed commerce, with clashes in Sanandaj and Mahabad against Revolutionary Guard forces. The participation of these groups underscores the multi-ethnic character of the protests, potentially breaking the regime's long-standing divide and conquer tactics. Tehran's response followed the classic authoritarian survival playbook: repression, isolation, and propaganda. Since January 8, 2026, authorities have imposed a nationwide internet and telecommunications blackout described by Amnesty International as a deliberate attempt to conceal the true scale of human rights violations. NetBlocks recorded a sharp drop in connectivity, amounting to an almost total blackout, cutting Iranians off from platforms such as X and Telegram, which were crucial for coordination in past protests. This digital blackout not only hinders the organization of demonstrations, but also blocks independent journalism and the verification of abuses. Smuggled videos show security forces, composed of the Basij militia and riot police, using live ammunition, tear gas, and pellet guns against unarmed crowds. In Tehran alone, hospital reports indicate at least 200 people wounded by gunfire on January 8th and 9th, with snipers targeting protesters in cities such as Andishe and Qom. The repression has been particularly savage in western provinces, where economic neglect and long-standing anti-regime sentiment run deepest. In Kermanshah and Loristan, strikes have evolved into large-scale clashes, with protesters setting fire to security force vehicles and public buildings. Security forces are reported to have intensified the use of lethal force since the blackout, resulting in additional deaths. Supreme Leader Khamenei, in a televised address on January 9th, labeled the protesters vandals and saboteurs seeking to please Donald Trump, calling for unity against terrorist actions. State media framed the protests as an economic war orchestrated by the United States and Israel. Judiciary Chief Gholam Hossein Mohseni-Ejei has promised decisive and maximum punishment, signaling mass trials and executions. This information war is vital to the regime. In dictatorships like Iran's, controlling the narrative is as important as controlling the streets. By cutting digital links, Tehran seeks to dominate the information battlefield, preventing the spread of videos of atrocities and isolating protesters. However, cracks are beginning to appear. Reports of desertions among lower-ranking security forces, exhausted after years of repressing their own compatriots, suggest internal tensions. In Shahrekord, clashes on January 2nd saw protesters arming themselves with improvised weapons, forcing security forces to retreat. The regime's brutality, while effective in the short term, risks alienating even its core base, including conservative clerics in Qom, who joined strikes due to the economic crisis. The protests do not occur in a vacuum, but amid heightened external threats, fueling the regime's paranoia. U.S. President Donald Trump, newly inaugurated after his 2024 victory, issued direct warnings to Tehran. On January 9, 2026, Trump declared, "If they start killing people, which they tend to do during uprisings, we will hit them very hard." This statement echoes previous threats and aligns with recent U.S. actions, including strikes on Iranian nuclear facilities in late 2025 amid escalating tensions. Trump's comments come in the context of the 12-day war with Israel in October 2025, when Israeli airstrikes destroyed much of Iran's air defense systems, achieving unprecedented air superiority over Tehran. Iran lost significant missile capabilities and assets, leaving it vulnerable. These external pressures compound the internal crisis. Israel, under Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, reportedly discussed second-round strategies with Trump at Mar-a-Lago, focusing on containing Iran's nuclear ambitions. The United States intensified sanctions, targeting commanders. European leaders, including the European Union Parliament, expressed support for the protesters, with figures such as German MEP Hannah Neumann stating that the regime rules against its own people. Exiled Crown Prince Reza Pahlavi encouraged Iranians to make their voices heard, positioning himself as a symbol of secular reform. Starlink satellites, repositioned over Iran by Elon Musk, provide connectivity despite the blackout, potentially aiding coordination. For Tehran, this two-front assault, unrest at home, sanctions and military threats abroad, creates a perfect storm. The regime's aggressive foreign policy, once a source of pride, now further isolates it. Allies such as Russia and China offer rhetorical support but little concrete assistance, preoccupied with their own conflicts. Ukraine for Russia, tensions over Taiwan for China. Protests drag on, and international escalation could follow, with Trump authorizing strikes on military bases or nuclear facilities should mass killings occur. Looking ahead, two main trajectories emerge for Iran's turmoil. The first repeats past episodes, such as the 2019 fuel protests or the Yemeni Uprising in 2022. Short-term repression manages to suffocate the streets but fails to resolve the root causes. The regime could deploy overwhelming force, mass arrests, executions, and security mobilizations to dismantle coordination, retake urban centers, and restore order. Strikes may dissipate under economic pressure, and the blackout would prevent a unified national movement. In this scenario, the regime survives but weakened. Economic problems persist, elite divisions deepen, and the next spark draws closer. Historical precedents abound. The 2009 Green Movement was crushed, but the seeds of dissent continued to grow. The alternative is more volatile, a prolonged crisis that escalates into an existential threat to the regime. If the protests maintain momentum, with strikes paralyzing key sectors such as oil or transportation, the combination of internal pressure and external intervention could prove fatal. Desertions within the army or the Revolutionary Guard, already rumored in provinces such as Kurdistan, could shift the balance. International actions such as US or Israeli strikes in response to repression could fragment the leadership, with hardliners pushing for confrontation while moderates seek concessions. This explosive combination echoes the dynamics of the 1979 revolution: economic crisis, repression, and external isolation leading to collapse. In survival mode, the regime prioritizes control over reform, often at the high cost of deeper isolation, societal impoverishment, and a more aggressive foreign policy, possibly accelerating the nuclear program or attacks. However, 2026 may mark a turning point. With the return of Trump's maximum pressure and widening internal fissures, the protests could catalyze a renaissance for Iran, giving rise to a secular and democratic state. As Pahlavi argues, a post-theocratic Iran could stabilize the region, contain terrorism, and foster peace. The world is watching closely. These protests are not only Iran's story, but a global narrative, testing authoritarian resilience in an interconnected era. Trump's warnings underscore the stakes. The responses of Tehran and Washington could redraw the maps of the Middle East. For Iranians, the struggle is existential: freedom or continued tyranny. As one smuggled message from a protester states, "This is the final battle." Whether it leads to victory or more bloodshed remains uncertain, but the echoes of change are undeniable.